Good afternoon, everyone. This is Virginia Castro. I'm a Technical Energy Project Specialist with the U.S. Department of Energy State Energy Program. Thank you for joining our two-part webinar series, the second of our two-part webinar series, Demonstrating Value, How to Use Benefit Cost Analysis to Evaluate Energy Mitigation Projects. Before we get started, we have a few technical instructions for you. If you have questions during the presentation, please submit them via the Q&A pod located under the attendee list on the left side of your screen. We will be collecting your questions throughout the presentation, and they will inform our Q&A discussion at the end of the session. Next, I'd also like to point out that you can download a PDF of today's presentation as well as last week's presentation from the Downloads pod located in the bottom right area of your screen, along with several other resources. Please note that this webinar is scheduled until 4 p.m. Eastern. However, depending on the amount of feedback and questions we receive from you, we may wrap up a little bit earlier. Following the presentations, we also request your feedback on the webinar with a few short poll questions. The questions are optional, but we greatly appreciate your feedback. It helps us make future webinars even better. All right, with that, let's get started. For those of you who joined us last week in Part 1, Mitigating Natural Hazard Risks in the Energy Sector, Innovative Projects that Help Build Resilient Communities, welcome back. And to everyone on the webinar today, thank you again for taking the time to join us. This webinar series is a product of a collaboration between the U.S. Department of Energy's Office of Energy Efficiency and Renewable Energy, Weatherization and Intergovernmental Programs, and FEMA, the Federal Energy Emergency Management Agency Hazard Mitigation Assistance Division, and is primarily intended for federal, state, tribal, and local community officials who are interested in learning about innovative, energy-specific hazard mitigation projects and metrics. Last week, our discussion was focused on programs and projects, and today we'll focus our discussion on metrics for evaluating potential energy-specific hazard mitigation projects. In today's presentation, we'll hear from Tara Siebold, a policy analyst with FEMA's Hazard Mitigation Assistance Division. Tara will discuss FEMA's Benefit Cost Analysis, BCA, program guidelines, methodologies, and tools for valuing energy mitigation lifeline projects. While the BCA toolkit is used for FEMA's hazard mitigation assistance programs and public assistance grant programs, it has a broad range of applications for other federal agencies, for states, tribes, and local governments. Participants today will learn how to use the BCA toolkit as it applies to energy sector projects to build resilient communities. Lastly, I'd like to take a moment to thank our colleagues at FEMA for sharing their expertise and hosting this platform for this webinar series to bring together state energy offices and state hazard mitigation offices virtually. With that, I would like to turn this presentation over to Tara.
Hi, I'm Tara Siebold. Thank you all for joining us. As Virginia said, I work with the Hazard Mitigation Assistance Division as part of our Benefit Cost Analysis program. And today I will be giving you an overview of the BCA toolkit, some of the background on how to do an energy lifelines mitigation project, and then also a demo of the BCA toolkit. So for those of you who were not able to join last week or who would just like a refresher, FEMA's Hazard Mitigation Grant Programs helps FEMA's mission of supporting people before, during, and after disasters. The goal of hazard mitigation is to protect life and property from future disaster damages and to reduce risk from disasters. So FEMA has 3 programs that fall under the Hazard Mitigation Assistance bucket that specifically fund hazard mitigation. The first is the Pre-Disaster Mitigation Program, which will be replaced by the Building Resilient Infrastructure and Communities Program, or BRIC, in fiscal year 2020, or next year, that is. So this is an annual competitive all hazards grant program. The second one is the Hazard Mitigation Grant Program. This is an all hazards mitigation program that is available after every presidentially declared disaster. The third one is the Flood Mitigation Assistance Program. This is an annual competitive program similar to PDM and BRIC that focuses on flood risk, specifically for the purpose of reducing damages and claims to the National Flood Insurance Program. Lastly, FEMA also does hazard mitigation through the Public Assistance Program, so that's specifically for the mitigation of damaged public infrastructure.
Great, thank you, Tara. This is Virginia Castro. At the federal level, this slide illustrates DOE's role as serving the Emergency Support Function 12 in times of a disaster because of the department's energy expertise. The Energy Lifeline is it has 3 parts to it: for the power grid, for temporary power for critical facilities, as well as for fuel. And the Lifeline enables the continuous operation of government functions and critical business and is essential to human health and safety or economic security.
So why does FEMA require a benefit cost analysis for mitigation projects? There are a number of reasons to do a BCA. It can help you decide between multiple projects. It can also help get support from a community. But another reason that we require this is that we have a statutory requirement laid out in the Stafford Act, which is the law that authorizes all of these programs, that FEMA has to fund cost-effective hazard mitigation projects. So FEMA uses the benefit cost analysis process to show the cost-effectiveness of hazard mitigation projects in accordance with the White House Office of Management and Budget, Circular A94, which provides guidelines on what constitutes a benefit cost analysis and how to do it. So the benefit cost analysis process is the process of quantifying the benefits of an action and comparing it to its costs. This results in a benefit cost ratio, or BCR. So the BCR is the benefits of a project divided by the costs of that project. So in this case, that's the costs to implement the project. In order to be eligible for FEMA funding, hazard mitigation projects must have a BCR of at least 1.0 or greater. If you are not applying for FEMA funding, it is not necessarily required to have a BCR of 1.0 or greater. However, there are reasons to only fund projects with a BCR of 1.0. So FEMA's BCA toolkit, to facilitate the process of preparing a BCA for states, locals, tribes, and territories, FEMA has developed software called the BCA Toolkit. We are currently on version 6.0 of the BCA Toolkit. This version is an Excel-based tool that calculates a benefit cost ratio for hazard mitigation projects. Some of you might be familiar with the previous version, 5.3. I would like to point out that we are still accepting BCAs done in 5.3 for this cycle of PDM and FMA. However, after this year, we will only be accepting BCAs done in version 6.0. So it really is to your benefit to start transitioning to 6.0 and to familiarize yourself with the new toolkit. Our primary users are FEMA grant applicants. However, this toolkit can be used to analyze any hazard mitigation project, regardless of size or funding source. So you can use this toolkit to analyze a $20,000 project as easily as you can use it to analyze a $20 million project. It has also been used by other federal agencies. We do not restrict it to FEMA projects only, but that is the main use. So having a BCA is a required component of FEMA hazard mitigation grant applications. There are a few exceptions, for example, if you are updating a hazard mitigation plan, but it is required for all FEMA mitigation projects that involve any sort of construction or structural component. The Department of Housing and Urban Development Community Development Block Grant Mitigation funding, their grant applicants may also use the BCA toolkit to validate cost effectiveness. The requirements for that are laid out in their CDBG mitigation notice of funding opportunity. So how is the BCR calculated? And again, the BCR is the benefits divided by the costs. So this equation is deceptively simple. For example, first of all, what count as benefits? There are certain things that might be benefits to a local community that do not count as benefits from FEMA's perspective. The other thing to note is that FEMA does count all benefits regardless of who is benefiting. So we do not restrict this to benefits just to the federal government. This can be benefits to the federal government, to state governments, locals, individual homeowners as well. How do we quantify these benefits? For example, how do we quantify the value of electrical power? FEMA does have methodologies for quantifying these benefits as well. So this calculation, benefits divided by costs, doesn't really seem to take into account things like project useful life, how long the project is going to last, project effectiveness, to what level the project provides protection, hazard risk and probability, how often is this going to occur, and the discount rate. The BCA toolkit, however, does take all of those things into account. So when it is giving you your benefits divided by your costs, it is accounting for all of those things as well. So what count as benefits? Benefits in a FEMA BCA are any future costs or losses or damages that are avoided as a result of the mitigation project. So these future costs or losses can include direct damages, which are often also called physical damages, for example, to the structure itself or damages to the contents of a structure. They can also include displacement costs. For example, if a person's home is damaged, how much does it cost to put them up in a hotel and to feed them? Loss of function or loss of service for utilities, roads, bridges, infrastructure, or really any type of facility that provides a service to the public. Emergency management costs, for example, sandbagging, or costs to block off roads or redirect traffic. And then deaths and injuries for certain types of hazards can also be quantified. So what would this look like for an energy mitigation project? Well, for example, if a community strengthens its power lines, whether through undergrounding or by hardening them against high wind events or ice storms, that community is then less likely to lose power in the event of a disaster or other type of hazard event. So not only does the electrical service itself have a value that can be quantified, there might also be fewer repair costs and emergency management costs. This could be sending out workers to close a road with live wires, redirecting traffic, or cleaning up debris. These avoided costs would be included as benefits of the mitigation project, because once the mitigation project is completed, you no longer have to send those people out to do that type of repair work. So some potential damages that you might expect from a power outage. The first is going to be loss of electrical service. In a lot of cases, that will provide the majority of your benefits. Loss of function for public services. So again, if a police station loses power because the lines fail, there is a cost to the community for losing that police service. So this can also include fire stations, EMS, hospitals, transportation such as airports and roads, public buildings, any sort of public facility. If they lose power, they can no longer provide that service, and that does have a cost. Contents damages, this might be spoiled food or electronics damages. Those can all be included as well, so the damages would be the cost to replace whatever gets damaged. Displacement costs. So again, for residential structures, this is the cost to stay in a hotel and then to feed however many people are displaced. For public facilities, this would be whatever the costs are for moving to a temporary location in order to operate elsewhere. Repair costs, so whatever it costs to repair the structure to get back up and running. And then emergency management and response costs. So again, if the police have to work overtime to direct traffic, that time can be quantified as a cost as well. So quantifying loss of service, there are multiple ways to do this depending on the type of facility. For electrical service, however, we do have a standard value. The value is $148 per person per day. It's important to note that when looking at the loss of electrical service, the number of people is not necessarily the same as the number of ratepayers. For example, if the average household has 2.5 people living in a house, then you might want to take the number of ratepayers and multiply that by 2.5, because you know that all of those people would be losing power and would therefore benefit from the power staying on. You can also use U.S. Census data to estimate the number of people that might lose power and not have to use number of ratepayers and convert that into a person amount. So this is an estimate of the value to society of electrical service. This does take into account residential, industrial, and commercial users. If you would like more information about how this value was developed, we do have a standard values methodology report, which you can request from the BCA helpline. The email address for the helpline is below. It's also on our website. We do update these values periodically to adjust for inflation and other changes. So what do not count as benefits for the purpose of FEMA BCAs? Now, if you are not applying for FEMA funding, you might be able to include these, but these are not allowable as benefits for any FEMA-funded hazard mitigation project. Secondary effects of the project, for example, increased employment, increased or decreased tax base, economic growth, are not allowable. Those are what's known as indirect benefits. Those cannot be included in a FEMA BCA. Anything that is not quantifiable, for example, the aesthetic value of a project or increased resilience. That might be a significant benefit of the project, but you would have to quantify in other terms how it's increasing the resilience, for example, by decreasing power outages. Energy cost savings, while these might be the primary benefit of other types of projects or grant programs, you cannot include energy cost savings in a FEMA BCA, nor can you include reduced insurance premiums. These are both what are known as transfer payments, so instead of actually reducing the risks or the costs, you're just transferring them to someone else. Reduced pollution or greenhouse gas emissions also cannot be included in a FEMA BCA. These might be quantifiable, but they're often very hard to tie to the project directly, so these are also not allowed. So some background on our BCA toolkit. In 1999, the GAO published a report that FEMA's BCA methodology and process were not standardized and were very difficult for users to do a BCA. So FEMA developed the BCA toolkit as a way of standardizing the methodologies and making it easier for states, locals, tribes, and territories to do this. So in 2006 to 2008 or so, FEMA re-engineered the BCA toolkit and established the currently used methodologies, equations, and standard values. We have updated some of the information in the toolkit since, for example, the hazard information, so hurricane wind speeds, earthquake risk, and tornado counts. We do update those, I believe, annually or whenever that data is available. But the basic methodologies and equations were reevaluated, re-engineered in 2006 and 2007 using subject matter experts and a panel who would then approve the methodologies. So all BCAs performed in the BCA toolkit do comply with the guidance laid out in OMB Circular A94. If the FEMA does require that you use the BCA toolkit unless you have pre-approved in writing that you can use a different methodology. And that's only allowable when the FEMA methodology cannot actually quantify your benefits. So the newest version of the toolkit is version 6.0, and this is an Excel-based add-in. You can use it in Microsoft and Mac, so that's new from version 5.3. You can download it at this website, which is the FEMA BCA website. The tool calculates a benefit-cost ratio for a project by estimating the damages before and then the damages after mitigation. That is the benefits of the project and dividing it by its costs. So again, the BCR is benefits divided by costs. The benefits are the damages before mitigation minus the damages after mitigation. So before we dive into the BCA toolkit itself, we're going to kind of step back a little bit. So we will cover the specific data requirements, but first it's helpful to kind of consider these questions when doing your BCA as a way of framing your project and making sure that you've thought through it properly so that you can include all potential benefits. So what is the overall intent of your project? This is not necessarily the same as the physical work being performed. For example, your intent might be to reduce power outages, but you could achieve that through multiple different projects. You could use generators, undergrounding power lines, hardening power lines. There are different ways to achieve the same goal, so it is important to keep that in mind when you're doing your BCA. What is the actual goal or intent of your project? What are the facilities or public services that will be protected by the project? This could be utilities, fire stations, police stations, government services, hospitals, businesses, etc. It's important to understand all the facilities that will be protected by your project so that you can capture those in your BCA. We often see projects that do not capture all the benefits. It's very important to do this, to make sure that you really have an understanding of all the structures that will be protected by your project or impacted by your project. What is the level of effectiveness of your project? This is also known as the level of protection. So all projects have a point at which they will fail. If you're elevating a generator, at some point the floodwaters will hit the generator. If you're hardening your power lines against ice storms or high wind events, at some point they will still fail. So you do have to know at what point that's going to happen in order to accurately calculate your BCR. What damages occurred that can be directly tied to the hazard being mitigated? This is also important. If your project will not reduce damages from a certain type of event, you cannot include those damages in your BCR. So if your project is dry flood proofing, you cannot include outages or damages from a high wind event because that might still cause outages. So what are the data that you need for a mitigation project? This depends somewhat on the type of project you're doing, but there are some data points that you will always need. You need to know the project location and the hazard being mitigated. For energy projects, this is generally not going to impact your BCR. This is more as a way of keeping track of your project. For other types of projects, though, the project location can impact your BCR, so it is important to use the actual project location. This can be an address, but it can also be a latitude and longitude coordinate, depending on if it's, for example, a facility or if it's a road that might not have a physical address. You can also use GPS coordinates. You need to know the project cost. This is important because this is the divider in the BCR ratio. You also need to know the project useful life, which is how long the project is going to be effective. The BCA Toolkit help content does provide standard values for many different project types. It also provides a range of acceptable values. So this information you would probably get from the project engineer or the manufacturer, depending on the type of project you're doing. For each facility being protected, you need to know the year in which it was built, the number of customers or annual budgets, depending on facility type. You also need to know past or estimated damages. This is either in dollars or in number of days service impacted, depending on the type of facility. Preferably, these damages should be associated with recurrence intervals. If they are not associated with recurrence intervals, you do have to know the year in which the damages occurred. You also need to know the level of project effectiveness. So what will the damages be after the project, and when will those damages occur? And then for getting more into the past or expected damages, so the software, to calculate the benefits of the project, the software bases it on past or expected damage amounts entered by the user. So again, these must be damages that would be mitigated by the project. If the power lines got chewed through by a squirrel and you're not undergrounding them, then the squirrel could still chew through those power lines. So that is not a kind of damage that could be mitigated by your project. Again, the damage amounts should be associated with a recurrence interval. For example, $60,000 of damage in the 1% annual chance storm. If they're not associated with a recurrence interval, you do have to know the year in which the damages occurred. The recurrence interval is the likelihood of a hazard event of a specific severity at a specific location. So recurrence intervals are location specific. A 100-mile-per-hour storm will have a very different recurrence interval in, say, Florida than it will in Washington, D.C. So you do need to know your recurrence interval for that specific location. If you do not know the recurrence interval for any of your past damage events, you will need at least 3 past events, and the software will calculate the recurrence intervals for you. If you do not have 3 events, you will always get a BCR of 0 because the software cannot calculate your damages without any recurrence intervals. It does not know how to estimate it. What it does is it fits the damages to a curve to see how often it expects those damages to occur over the life of the project. So having recurrence intervals is very important.
Great. Thank you, Tara.
The benefits, so for the project effectiveness, the damages after mitigation, these are also an important component. Because in order to properly estimate the damages after mitigation, again, the software needs to know at what point it will fail. So the recurrence interval and then the damage amount in dollars or number of days service impacted are what you need for your project effectiveness damages after mitigation. So for example, if your project would protect to the 100-year wind speeds, then you might start getting outages at the 101-year wind speed. Or in the 500-year event, you might expect 1 day of lost service even after the project is complete. So these are called residual damages, residual risk, level of protection, project effectiveness. Those terms are used fairly interchangeably. In most cases, this needs to be determined by your project engineer. Sometimes you do not need a project engineer. Again, for example, if you're elevating a generator or building some sort of flood barrier, if you have a flood insurance study, you would know at what point the flood will overtop that barrier or will reach the generator. And so, but you would still need an engineer to determine the loss of service that you would get in that event.
Thank you, Tara. Just wanted to highlight a reminder to participants that we will be fielding your questions at the end of the presentation section, and I encourage you to submit your questions at any point throughout the presentation via the Q&A pod on the left side of your screen. We'll then do our best to answer as many questions as we can during the Q&A session. Thank you.
So we're going to do a demo, but before we do that, I'm going to run through some of the basic information that we require just so you can get a sense of the type of information you'll need and how that changes based on structure type. So if we were developing a campus microgrid, so some sort of grid that could operate independently of the power grid if the power grid failed, we would need to know some basic information about it. So how many residents are there? In this case, there are 10,000 residents, and most of the buildings are built after 1990. So in addition to 10,000 residents, there's also a couple of critical facilities that would be impacted by the project. So electrical service, obviously, police station, health clinic, and educational facilities. All of these would benefit from having this microgrid. So some basic project data. The microgrid is expected to last for 30 years. The initial cost to build this is $2.2 million, and then the annual maintenance costs are $5,000. It is important to include maintenance costs and to know what those are averaged over the life of the project, because the project will not maintain its level of effectiveness if it is not maintained. So that is a component that you need to consider as well. So the first structure is a utilities structure. So this is specifically for electrical service. It was built in 1990. It serves 10,000 customers, and it does have a past damage history. We have also gotten after mitigation damages from the project engineer, in this case, a half-day loss of service in the 100-year event with some contents damage remaining. So for a utility service, the impact for the primary damages is in days. The secondary damages are generally in dollar amounts. So this would be costs to repair whatever got damaged, maybe costs to pay workers overtime, but those are going to be in dollar amounts. The primary damages are in days, and these can be fractions of days as well. So the contents damages, anything that is included, should be damages resulting from the power outage that are not captured under other structures. So an example of that would be spoiled food in the dining hall. If that is not captured elsewhere, then that could be captured here. But you do want to make sure you're not double counting your benefits anywhere. So the second structure is a police building built in 1991, serving 15,000 people. So this has a different service population, so that's important to make note of. And it also has a damage history with, again, a half-day loss of service in the 100-year event and some remaining emergency response costs. The third facility is a health clinic built in 1994. For this type of facility, instead of knowing the population served, you need to know the annual budget. That's because essentially what it's saying is that how much the public pays for this facility is how much it is worth. So if the operating budget is $7 million, then it is worth $7 million to the community. This also would have some loss of function in the 100-year event, and it does have a damage history. The fourth structure is a school building. Anything that is defined as a critical facility in your local hazard mitigation plan can be included as a critical facility in a FEMA BCA. So if, for example, you identified schools as critical facilities, maybe they were going to serve as shelters, those could be included as a critical facility in the FEMA BCA. So again, we would be using the year built, the annual budget, and the damage history to estimate the BCR for this structure. So now I will do a demo. All right, so this is the FEMA BCA toolkit. I downloaded it from the FEMA BCA website, and then I have already installed the add-in. If you hadn't, you would go to Insert and install it from there. There are detailed instructions on how to do this on the FEMA BCA website. Can you all see this? Okay. So now I can click on this little scale in the upper right-hand corner, and it's going to open up a sidebar. I can then click Open Calculator, and it's going to open up a second screen. Now I have no projects. This is a blank file. but once I have projects, they will appear here on what's known as the home screen. There is also help content. The help content is always identified with this little white eye and a blue circle. So if I click on this, it's going to give me some basic information about the BCA process. So what is a BCA and the BCR? What are considered project benefits? What are considered costs? This information is dynamic. So if I am on a different screen, I will see different help content appear. So I can click that X and go back to my home screen. Now I can click Add Project, and it's going to take me to the project configuration page. So this is where I start entering in my project-specific information. So my project title for this one can be Microgrid Resilience Project, and then my address is going to be FEMA headquarters. So once I start typing, addresses will start to appear. This property location bar is connected to Leaflet, which is a web map application service. So what this does is it allows us to standardize our addresses and make sure we're getting accurate information. For example, for latitude and longitude. If I don't have an address, again, I can click this little toggle and say use property location no, and then I can type in my own latitude and longitude. So now I select the property structure type. So this first structure that we are going to do is the electrical service. So for that, I would select utilities. And then I would most likely want to select infrastructure failure. So the reason for this is that a microgrid would generally protect against outages from multiple types of events. It might protect it from simply routine power outages, flooding, or high wind events, depending on how it's designed. So really what I'm mitigating here is loss of power outage because the infrastructure itself is failing and not necessarily flood-specific damages. So for this, I will select infrastructure failure. Now, because I selected utilities, it defaulted to historical damages, which is the type of data that we have. For other types of projects, I might use model damages or professional expected damages. Model damages, it bases the damages on structure type. So for example, flood depth in a house would use model damages for the most part. Professional expected damages I would use if I did not have a damage history, but I did have documentation from an engineer or other licensed professional telling me the number of damages I could expect and the associated recurrence intervals. So then for the project useful life, we know that this is 30. Now, there are little comment boxes on the side as well. So in the old toolkit, you would attach documents to provide justification for any of the values that you entered. We got rid of that in version 6.0 because it was causing a lot of issues with the file size and with uploading the BCAs. So instead, there's a comment box where you can say the letter from manufacturer or project engineer in application. So this is where you would note for the BCA reviewer where to find this documentation. This is particularly for if you are applying for a FEMA grant. So then the project costs. So we are protecting multiple structures, but I'm going to enter the project costs all on one structure. This is because I don't necessarily know how the costs are broken out between the structures. I could break them out evenly and just say each cost is a quarter of the total cost, or I could put all the project costs on one structure. The way the math breaks down is the same. So year of analysis conducted defaults to the current calendar year. Year the property was built for the utility is 1990. So it's a 30-year analysis duration. If, for example, something changed, maybe my flow conditions changed for a flood project, I could use a different analysis duration, but I would have to document why I was doing that. The type of service is going to be electrical. The other types of service for which we have standard values are potable water and wastewater. I will select electrical, and then it defaults to 148, which is the value of service per person per day. And then I know that the number of customers, or the number of people, which is not necessarily the same as the number of ratepayers, is 10,000 for this particular substation or whatever this is. So then the value of service per day is 1.48 million. So then I would scroll down to historical damages before mitigation, and I would start entering in my information. So for the damage year, I know that the largest event, or the event with the longest impact, was in 2001. So there are multiple ways you can enter this information. I do recommend entering it either chronologically or in order from largest to smallest, because that it does, sometimes the toolkit will otherwise mix the recurrence intervals up, and that can cause issues. So I would put in 3 impact days. I don't know my recurrence interval, so I will leave that blank. And then I will put in $25,000 in other damages. So I can then rename this column contents dollars to show that it is contents and that the value is in dollars. So currently I'm getting $0 in annualized damages and losses, and again, it's because I don't know my recurrence interval. I need to add 2 more events before I start actually seeing any benefit. So then next I would add in my 2016 event, which had 2.5 days of lost service and $22,500 in contents damage. I would click Add Row again, enter in my 1995 event, 2 days, $14,000. And as soon as I click out, even before, I start seeing damages. So as soon as I have that 3rd event, it starts calculating annualized damages and losses. Now I can add my 4th event, 2013, 1.5, and $10,000. It's also important to note that if you enter into events that have the same exact number of impact days or the same damage year, the math will not work properly. So what you can do, if I had 2 events in 2016 and one had a 1-day loss of service and one had a 3-day loss of service, is I could change the damage year for the 2nd event to 2017 or for the 1st event to 2015. The difference is close enough that it's not going to actually affect your recurrence intervals if you change it by 1 year, but it will make your BCR more accurate. The other thing you can do is if you have 2 half-day losses of service in the same year that would both be mitigated by the project, is that you can combine them into 1 event. However, your damages need to be comparable. So I would not combine a 1-day and a 3-day event, but I could combine 2 half-day events into 1 one-day event. So then I know that this is going to provide protection to the 100-year event. So for my expected damages after mitigation, I enter my recurrence interval, my half-day loss of service, and my $5,000 contents damage. Now I am getting a benefit cost ratio of 2.5 just from this one structure. There are, however, 3 more structures in the project. So I can click Finish, and then I come to the project summary screen. So I see my project here, and I see a map of the project location. If I want to add another mitigation action or another structure to my project, I would click Add Mitigation Action. and it would bring me back to the project configuration page for a new structure. So again, the project title, it's saved, but the property location might be different, so I would type in that property location. So for this one, the structure type is police, so I would select critical facility. And then hazard type, so it's not letting me select infrastructure failure. This is because the default methodology for critical facility is model damages. However, I have historical damage data, so I'm going to switch to historical damages. Now when I click on hazard type, I see all of them. So now I can select, again, infrastructure failure. So my project useful life is still 30 years. My project costs, I entered the total project costs for this project on the electrical utilities structure, so I can put in $1 here. I do have to put in a value here, or the software tries to divide by 0 and you get an error message, but this will not change your overall BCR. If I really wanted to be precise, I could subtract $1 from the project costs for the utilities project. So the year the property was built, 1991. The critical facility type is police station. So I would select that, and then I would get a number of other questions that I have to answer. So the type of area served by the police station, so that the options are metropolitan, city, and rural. This is the type of information you would most likely get from the local jurisdiction. So I will select a metropolitan area because I selected a DC address. So then how many people are served by the police station? This is information you would most likely get from the police chief or perhaps your office of emergency management, office of planning, depending on the jurisdiction. I will enter in 10,000 here. How many police officers work at this station? This is essentially estimating the number, how many services are provided to the community in a regular event, and then how many services would be provided to the community in the event of this station losing power. So maybe in the event of the station losing power, they would have to have the neighboring police station split their people between the two jurisdictions, so they might have half as many people. So for damages before mitigation, again, I will be basing this on the damage year and the emergency response cost. So I can change this. $2001, 3 days, and $15,000. And the response costs could be based on, for example, overtime pay, if they had any equipment costs that they needed to rent or to use. It could also be based on time spent doing things like redirecting traffic or closing down roads, sandbagging facilities. All of those would count as emergency response or emergency management costs that would be allowable. So they would have to provide some sort of documentation that they had this many police officers who spent this long, and then quantify that into a dollar cost. So I will do the same for the 2016 event with 2.5 days loss of function and $19,000. The 1995 event with 2 days loss of police services and $8,000, and then the 2013 event with 1.5 and 7,000. And again, once I got to 3 events, the toolkit started calculating my recurrence intervals, and then it was able to provide annualized damages. The toolkit does also inflate damages for any dollar values that are entered to present day dollars. So if you are just entering in your impact days, the toolkit will not inflate those because those are already in current dollars. If you are entering dollar values from 2000, it will inflate those to current values. So now for damages after mitigation, again, I know my recurrence interval is the same, 100. The impact is 0.5 days, and the response costs would be $3,000. And now I'm getting a benefit cost ratio. So the toolkit thinks that my benefit cost ratio is 181,000. That's because I entered in a project cost of $1. However, when I click Finish and I go to my project summary screen, it's actually giving me a BCR of 2.59. This is because it's averaging it out with total project benefits and total project costs. So when you submit a FEMA BCR, you do not submit the BCR for each structure. You submit the total project BCR. So this averages the BCRs for all the structures in the project. Not every structure needs to be cost-effective on its own. The total project BCR must be 1.0 or greater. So if, for example, my benefits for the electrical facility had not been greater than 1, that would be acceptable as long as the other structures in the project were cost-effective enough to bring my total project BCR above a 1.0. So now I can add in my health clinic as well. So I can click Add Mitigation Action again, my address, my structure type for this one is, again, a critical facility. And I will switch to historical damages and then select infrastructure failure. My project useful life is still 30. My project costs are 1. For this one, the year built was 1994. And for the critical facility type, I would select other. That's because this is not fire, police, or hospital. But again, as long as it's a critical facility identified in your FEMA hazard mitigation plan, you can include that loss of function in your BCA. So for the service name, I would enter in the name of the facility or the service it provides. In this case, I'll say health clinic. And then the annual operating budget, which is $7 million. The toolkit then converts that to dollars per day in order to estimate the loss of service value of that facility. And again, the reason that we use operating budget is because we can assume that what the public pays for a facility is what it is worth to them to have. So for the damage history, I will enter in 2016, 2001 actually, because that's my largest event, and then enter in 3.5 days. So this facility has longer impact times than the other facilities, but the same damages. That's acceptable as long as you can document it. So for example, for certain types of facilities, you might lose power for a day, but you might need an additional half day or 6 hours to get the facility back up and running. So even once you have power, if you are not able to operate, you can include that as additional outage time as long as you can document it. So if a wastewater facility lost power for a day and then needed an additional day to get the functions restarted, that would be allowable to include in your loss of service. So there are no other damages for this facility, so then I would just add in my other damage events. So 2016 and 3 days, 1995 and 2.5 days, and 2013 and 2 days. So the damage is after mitigation, a 100-year event, and again, this would have a 1-day loss of function. Now I can click Finish and see my total project BCR, which is currently 2.6. So now for the last structure, the education facility, I can again click Add Mitigation Action. For structure type, I would also select critical facility, switch to historical damages, and then select infrastructure failure, enter in the project useful life, and your initial project costs. So if I didn't know my project useful life, if I didn't have that information from my engineer, one thing I can do is click on this I button, that's the help content, and there is a table here that provides some project useful life values as well as acceptable limits. So if I were doing a utility mitigation project involving power lines, cable hardening, or gas water sewer lines, the acceptable documentation limit is for 50 to 100 years, and the standard value is 50. Now, if I were purchasing some other type of equipment, the standard value is 30 years. So the standard value depends on the type of project you're doing, but FEMA does provide some standard values and also acceptable limits. It also provides information on, for example, number of maintenance years and maintenance costs, as well as the project and configuration. So what appears here depends not just on what screen I'm on, but also on which button I click. So if I click the I button here, it knows that I want the project configuration help content, whereas if I click the I button here, it directs me to the cost estimation help content. So now I can click Next. Year built, 1890. Critical facility type, again, I'm going to select Other. School, and then the operating budget for this is $40 million. So I would again enter in my past damages with my damage year and my impact days. .5 days of loss of service. Maybe, for example, the school lost service halfway through the day, so they couldn't operate for the rest of that day and the following 2 days. And then again, the toolkit is now calculating my recurrence intervals, my annualized damages. So my damages after mitigation, 100. And because we don't know if the loss of service would happen in the middle of the day or halfway through the day, we'll say that they would lose a full day of service because school would be out for a full day. So functionally, they would not be able to operate for a full day. So then we're getting our BCR. And again, because we put in $1 for the project cost, it's giving us a BCR of $410,000. But when we click Finish, we get our total project BCR, which is 2.82. So now I can look at my report. If I were submitting this to FEMA, the report is what I would submit. So this will show all of the information that I just inputted, all in one place. If I provided comments, again, for my justification, which you should always do if you are doing this for a FEMA grant, these would also appear here. So it includes this information for every structure that you inputted into your BCA. In order to save this, I would click Print Report, and then I would print this to a PDF. So I could do Microsoft Print to PDF, click Print, save it to somewhere. In this case, I'll save it to my desktop. And now I can go in and open up my BCA report. Okay. And again, it's going to have the same information that was in the toolkit that I just entered. So now I can close my report. Takes me back to the project summary screen. And there are all my structures within my project. Now when I go to the home page, it will show me my microgrid resilience project. So it is important when you close out of that window to make sure you save it. The toolkit will not auto-save for you, so just because you hit finish in your project screen, it is not saved until you save the Excel spreadsheet. That is very important to make note of. There is a little message here reminding you of that, and when you click Excel, it will ask if you want to save the file. Always say yes. If you say no, your project will not save. So do remember to save your file. So now I've hit save, and if I close this, it is still saved. So now we're going to go back to the presentation and run through an example project, or rather an actual project in, I believe, in Puerto Rico or the USVI.
Puerto Rico.
Puerto Rico. So
last week's presentation.
Yes, so we went over this project in last week's presentation, and now we will go through how to do a BCA for that project. So Puerto Rico PV and Storage Energy Resiliency Project, the project cost is approximately $240,000. Now, the goal of the project from a DOE perspective is to increase residential energy resiliency and reduce energy consumption from the grid. The goal from a FEMA perspective is to reduce loss of power and any associated damages or loss of function that comes from that loss of power. So again, just because your project goal might not, the primary goal might not be risk reduction, doesn't mean there aren't risk reduction benefits that you need to consider when doing a FEMA BCA. So this project covered 20 homes in Caguas and Arecibo. It did not protect any critical facilities. The function it provided was providing electrical service to those 20 homes, which contained 56 people. So 20 homes times 2.81 people per household is 56 customers. And 2.81 is the average household size for that area. I believe that was from census data. So the first structure is the utility, electrical service, the past damage events. We looked at the wind speeds for Hurricane Maria and estimated that for those specific parts of Puerto Rico, those wind speeds constitute a 50-year event. So 50 years is the recurrence interval that we will use. There was $20,000 of contents damage, $1,000 per home, a 75-day loss of power, $481,500 in displacement costs. So those were calculated using standard per diem rates. So for the continental U.S., those are calculated using GSA standard lodging rates for that particular area, town, county. For most of the territories, and including Puerto Rico, those are calculated using Department of Defense rates. So for this 20 households, it was $167 for lodging times 75 days, so it's $250,000 approximately. And then for food, so 56 people times $56, $55 per day times 75 days, so $231,000. Displacement costs can be quite high, so if they are applicable, it is a good idea to include them in your project, especially for long-term outages such as this. So for the first structure, this is the utility, electrical services. The after mitigation damages in the 100-year event, the project engineer estimated that there would be a half-day loss of electrical service, $5,000 in contents damages, and no displacement costs. So now we'll go back into the BCA toolkit. And because I saved my last project, it appears here. So now I can click Add Project. And then for this one, I can enter Puerto Rico PV project. Now for my address, enter in that. I don't actually know the zip codes for Puerto Rico off the top of my head. I will enter in. In this case, it will not make a difference. For some projects, however, it does make a difference. All right. 00725. Okay, for Cagua. Perfect. So now for structure type, I would again select utilities, or hazard type, infrastructure failure, and then again it defaults to historical damages. So let's say I don't know the project useful life for this. I can, however, go into our project useful life table and look up for utility mitigation projects. This is a major project involving power lines and hardening. So I can say 50 years is the FEMA standard value. So the reason that I'm selecting utilities for the homes is because, again, what I'm doing is I'm mitigating the loss of service to those facilities, to those structures. So I'm protecting residential facilities, but in order to get the value of the electrical service for the homes, I need to select utilities. So that is an important thing to note, and that's why it's important to think about your project beforehand and understand what you're trying to protect and also what function you're trying to protect. So in this case, again, it's electrical services. So my project costs are $239,900. And my maintenance costs, I can estimate at approximately $1,000 a year. So let's say I don't know the year that my property was built. That is okay. What I can do is go back to project configuration and then actually switch from historical to professional expected damages. This is because I happen to know the recurrence interval for my event. If I did not know the recurrence interval, I could not do this. But in this case, I can say your property was built. It doesn't really matter, and I can leave that blank. The reason you need to know the year the property was built is for the unknown recurrence interval calculator, because it needs to know how frequently the hazards occurred over a specific time frame. If you're looking at 3 events over 100 years versus 3 events over 20 years, those are going to be very different recurrence intervals. If I know the recurrence interval, that information is not necessary. So now for utility type, I will again select electrical. Number of customers served is 56. And then my recurrence interval is 50 years. I would need to document how I determined that. In this case, we used the Applied Technology Council's wind speed hazard map for this location, and then looked at the Hurricane Maria wind speeds in that location and determined that it was an approximately 50-year wind speed event. So the impact in terms of days was 75. So category 1, I can say, is contents dollars, and that's 20,000. And then displacement costs, and again, that's based on cost to lodge 56 people and also cost to feed 56 people for 75 days, and that's 481,500. So now my after mitigation damages, I do have to include those. And based from the project engineer or the manufacturer, we know that at the 100-year event, there would still be a half-day loss of service, $5,000 in contents damage, but no displacement costs. And now I am getting my project BCR of 1.22. So my total benefits from this project are $308,000. My total costs, including maintenance, are $253,000. So my project is cost effective. Now I can click Finish. And there I have my BCR. I can again view my report. I can print my report to a PDF and save it similar to the other project. So now again, I will close out and make sure to save. All right, so the limitations of FEMA's BCA toolkit, it can do a lot of different types of projects, but garbage in is garbage out. It's a calculator. It is not intended as a data validator, so it will not tell you if your numbers are reasonable or accurate. That is why you need to provide documentation to justify the values that you put in, specifically for a FEMA project, because the FEMA BCA reviewer will not know if these values are reasonable unless you can provide justification for them. The BCA toolkit is also intended to perform BCAs for physical projects, not programs, plans, or regulations. This, again, is for structural projects for the most part. That could include things like hardening infrastructure, undergrounding power lines, installing generators, photovoltaic systems, other types of things, but it cannot perform regulatory analyses. The toolkit also assumes that hazard risk is static over the project useful life. We know this is not always the case. For example, we know that damages to infrastructure that is 50 years old will probably be greater than the same infrastructure a year after, the same piece of infrastructure a year after it was built. As infrastructure ages, we know that the damages are likely to increase. The toolkit assumes that they are static. It also assumes, for example, that the hazard conditions and the probability don't change, so it cannot estimate how the 100-year flood event might change over the life of the project. That is another issue. It can incorporate sea level rise for certain specific types of projects, but for the most part, the hazard risk is static over the project useful life. It also assumes that costs associated with power outages are simply a factor of the service population and the outage duration. In reality, long-term power outages might have additional escalating costs that are not captured. This is simply a limitation of the way the value of electrical service was calculated and the number of unknowns in estimating escalating damages for long-term losses of function. So DOE does have an interruption cost estimate calculator, or ICE, tool. This is an online tool sponsored by DOE's Office of Electricity Delivery and Energy Reliability and hosted by the Lawrence Berkeley National Laboratory, which does enable users to estimate the economic costs of actual or hypothetical service outages to customers. So the ICE tool is based on customer data collected by more than 30 major utilities across the U.S. It is also easy to use. The user specifies the number of affected customers by type, the location, and the duration of the outage. However, ICE is not applicable for outages lasting longer than 24 hours. So if you have a short-term power outage and you believe that the BCA toolkit is underestimating your benefits, then you might want to look at the ICE calculator and see if that gives you a more accurate picture of your damages. If you have an outage greater than 24 hours, however, you do have to use the FEMA BCA standard value. ICE does have a number of users, including some outside the U.S. You can find more information on the ICE calculator website. So some common BCA challenges and issues that we run into: lack of documentation for data entered. This is probably the most common one. We do not know if your jurisdiction has 10,000 people or 50,000 people, so you do need to provide that type of information. Also for your damage history. FEMA provides a number of materials that outline acceptable sources for this documentation based on the data type. Insufficient data or documentation on project effectiveness. A lot of times people will just make something up and not provide any information on where these values came from, or they will not include after mitigation damages or information on project effectiveness. We cannot properly estimate what the BCR for a project is without after mitigation damages. We need to know at what point the project will fail. The BCR will be significantly different if the project fails at the 50-year event versus the 500-year event. So you do need to provide that information and documentation for the project effectiveness. And again, this can be a signed letter from the project engineer or other licensed professional. A lack of damage history. If the structure facility does not have a damage history, you can still do a benefit cost analysis, but again, you need to have some sort of study from an engineer or other licensed professional estimating the damages and associated recurrence intervals. You can also do a BCA for a structure that has only had one damage event, as long as you know the recurrence interval for that damage event. That used to not be the case. However, we do now allow BCAs with only one damage event. Another issue is including damages that would not be mitigated by the project. So again, if your outage was caused by a squirrel chewing through the power line, that's probably going to still happen unless you completely underground the entire system or create some sort of squirrel-proof box. So that would not be a damage that could be included. If you're mitigating against flood damages, for example, dry flood proofing, you cannot include damages from high wind events. Lack of recurrence interval data or incorrect interpretation of recurrence intervals is another common issue. If you have 3 or more events lacking recurrence interval data, does not preclude you from doing a BCA. However, if you only have 2 damage events, you do need to have recurrence intervals. It's also important to make sure you're using correct recurrence intervals. And again, those are location specific. So you want to make sure that your recurrence intervals are based on the severity and the location of that hazard. Not including all protected structures. This is an issue because sometimes when FEMA reviews the BCA, certain damage amounts go down. If you do not include all your protected structures, your project might no longer show as cost effective. A lot of times we will see cases where people stop including structures once they hit a 1.0 or a 1.1, It's important to include all your structures that are going to be protected by the project in case something changes or in case your costs go up. So some BCA resources that FEMA provides. The BCA Toolkit help content does have a lot of information on the project types and the types of data that you need for those project types, as well as where you can find them. There's also technical assistance available through the FEMA BCA helpline. These are subject matter experts who are able to both help you install and troubleshoot any software issues you might be having, as well as to provide some general methodology or to answer some general methodology questions. They cannot, however, do or review your BCA for you. State hazard mitigation officers and FEMA regional offices also can be good resources, especially if you have questions about project eligibility. Advanced assistance under HMGP and BRIC, and also this year PDM, can provide funding for engineering analyses and data collection to support BCAs. Advanced assistance is not a guarantee that your project will get selected if you submit it, but if you are having issues getting the data that you need for a BCA, it can help with that. FEMA's BCA training course materials are also available online. FEMA also does provide in-person trainings through the Emergency Management Institute for states, locals, tribes, and territories. You can also request an in-person training be delivered through your FEMA regional office, and they can help provide resources for that. The FEMA website, www.fema.gov/benefit-cost-analysis, has a lot of useful information and also a lot of links to other resources that can help. So it is definitely worth looking there if you have questions. Now, does anyone have any questions?
Great, thank you so much, Tara. This concludes the presentation portion of our webinar. We will now begin the Q&A session, answering the questions you've submitted throughout the presentation. We'll take a moment to read through the questions you've all submitted. But in the meantime, we'll post some webinar feedback polls, and if you would like, you can also provide your organization, title, and geographic location. These are optional, but again, we really appreciate your feedback as they help us to make our webinars even better. Also, please remember that you can download both presentations from Webinar 1 and Webinar 2 at the bottom right-hand corner of your screen. Thank you again for joining the webinar, demonstrating value, how to use benefit cost analysis to evaluate energy mitigation projects.